Okay, so back to the issue of connecting to our database. The problem, again, is that locally, remember our database is Mongo is this server right here that we're connecting to using Mongoose. This is local. And Heroku, our app on Heroku, has no access to this at all. So the solution that we're going to go with is to use a hosted Mongo database using something called MongoLab. So MongoLab is basically just an instance of Mongo running on a server somewhere that we can get a URL from that rather than being localhost, it will be MongoLab something URL that we can use in our application that exists outside of this local environment. It actually exists online somewhere. So mongolab.com. Before we get started, this is not the only solution. This is just a really simple, common solution. You can get Mongo installed locally on the Heroku instance. It's kind of a pain, and it has its own set of problems. So this is a really pretty standard tool to use. And the other thing is that it gives you great visual interface to interact with your database, to manage permissions, to do things like reset your database, heaven forbid, if you ever needed to do that, or look at different pieces of information, inspect things. It gives you a lot of cool tools. So sign up. You also need to use a real email address. So I'll just call this web dev bootcamp. Username will just be Colt. Email. And then add your password. Click accept. Oh, you have to read this apparently, or open this at least. Then click accept, and then click create account. So we're now in MongoLab. The next thing that we need to do is verify our email address. So go ahead and do that. Open up your email account, click the link that they send you. Okay, so I went ahead and verified my email. You can see here, my email address has been verified. Now I have access to these buttons. So this is our homepage, our dashboard, that allows us to create new Mongo deployments, which is the first thing that we want to do. So basically, we're just making another database that lives on MongoLab servers rather than our own. So go ahead and click on Create New. It'll take a little bit sometimes. Great. So what this lets us do now is create our new database on MongoLab. What we're going to do is stick with Amazon Web Services, but rather than replica set cluster, that is the powerful, high-speed, high availability, yet expensive. As you can see, they get really expensive options. We're not going to do that. We'll stick with single node, and for now we'll just do Sandbox. So that's the free plan. Then what we're going to do is create a name for our database. We'll just call it YelpCamp. Oh, that needs to be lowercase. YelpCamp. $0 a month looks good to me. Hit on create. Wait for this to finish up. All right. So we've started. We're almost there as far as what we need to do on MongoLab. We can click on this DS0555, whatever the URL that you get there. And you'll see that it gives us this URL. So if I just copy this URL, it's not going to work just yet, but I just want to show it to you. So if I copy it and go back to YelpCamp, where is that? Here we go. And just paste it below. Notice that it's very similar to this. It's a MongoDB URL. However, instead of localhost, it's mongolab.com/YelpCamp. And there's also this DB user, DB password that we're going to have to take care of. So that's why I said we're not quite done. So I'm going to go back, and we need to start, and it actually tells you this. A database user is required to connect to this database. Click here to create a new one. So we need to have a user. Basically, the way that this works is that on MongoLab, you can have different users, different permissions. We're not talking about users of our application, basically developers. So people who can connect to this database. You might want to have two apps that use the same database. You have like sales data that you've captured a bunch of leads, and you want to have marketing, but you also want your email team, or I don't know. You want to have different people, different teams have access to the same database, maybe with different permissions. You can actually manage that here. But we're just going to go with the simplest, just single user. So I need to create a username for this database. I'm just going to call it Colt. Password, I'm just going to make Rusty. So technically, you guys would be able to connect to this database because I am showing you this part. You would be able to connect to Rusty or to this database using my username and password, which is just for the database. Again, that's not the username and password for my account on MongoLab. It's just for that database. But you could go in and screw with, whatever super important data I have on YelpCamp. But I am going to show it to you just so that you see how it works. All right, so click create. So now we're going to go back. You can copy this if you didn't copy it yet, this URL. Go back here, and we need to update this. So instead of DB user, we want Colt, and instead of DB password, we want the password that I set, which is Rusty. Whatever password and username you set there is what you need to use. So I'm going to go ahead and comment the original line out that's using our local database. I'm going to copy this URL and use that to connect to. Now I'm not getting rid of this. In the next video I'm going to talk about why we don't want to just use the same database for development purposes and production. Well, I'll talk about that right now, but I'm going to show you a solution in the next video, so how we can have multiple databases. In this video, we're just going to get it running locally and on Heroku using this MongoLab, the same database. But usually you don't want to do that. You don't want to worry about screwing up data, deleting things, corrupting stuff. You want to keep it separate. But we're not doing that just yet. So let's just try connecting locally. So I'm going to go back here. Right now, our application with the change we made has nothing to do with this Mongo process running anymore. So when we start this up and refresh this page, if things went well, if our MongoLab database is set up correctly, there will be no campgrounds here. It should be empty. So let's try that. Make sure we're in the right directory. Node app.js says the server has started. Refresh. And as you can see, we have no campgrounds. So we are successfully connected to a database because we didn't get an error. If we hadn't successfully connected, if the URL was wrong, we would get something like error connection refused, like we did with Heroku just a few minutes ago. And we're not connected to the original database because we don't see any of that data. You may not have had the exact same data, obviously. You might have not had any campgrounds yet. You might have had 20 or 30, but in my case, it illustrates to you that we're now using this MongoLab setup. So let's just test it out, make sure that we can still sign up and successfully add new posts, new campgrounds. So I'll sign up with rusty@tater.com. Password will just be password. So we sign up. There we go. Let's add a new campground. The name is Rodeo Beach. Description is a beach with pretty rocks. And I'll use this image that I took last weekend, trying that whole photography thing out. Obviously, use whatever image you'd like. Make sure that it successfully creates, and it does. Awesome. Looks good. Okay, so we're now adding data to the MongoLab database, and if we actually go over to MongoLab and refresh, we should be able to see in collections, we now have two collections, campgrounds and users. So let's take a look at campgrounds, for instance. We'll take a moment to load, but you actually have access to the data here. You can see it. So it's pretty cool. It's a nice interface. You can do things like delete all documents, but I could also add something in here or edit something if I needed to. Generally, you don't want to be doing that, but it is pretty common to want to read the data out. Great, so we have it working locally. Now all we need to do is add that change and push it up to Heroku. So we'll go back, stop the server. We need to add that change in where we replaced the Mongo URL with MongoDB, MongoLab.com/whatever your particular URL is. Then we need to do a commit. So we'll just say add MongoLab and then git push Heroku master. So again, it goes through a bunch of stuff. It reinstalls all the packages. Actually, it checks to see if they have been installed already. It attempts to reinstall them, realizes it already has all of them. Then it's going to run npm start, and fingers crossed it will work this time. You never know with deploying. It's always sort of always a little bit of a crapshoot depending on what kind of things you've been doing. With my boot camp students, it was always a bunch of students who would wait until the very last minute to deploy right before a big presentation when companies were coming in. And that led to a lot of unexpected errors, and students assumed it would be straightforward because the simple app that we deployed took 5 minutes, and it turns out that they ran into some weird error, something went wrong with their, CSS compilation or something happened, and you run into these crazy errors deploying. So don't underestimate it. It's not always super, super smooth. Now, let's try and refresh this page, or this one here. Oops, here we go. Sorry, that was our old app. This one, which is YelpCamp. And let's look at the campgrounds. And there we go. So it's connecting to MongoLab now. Remember that this is sharing the data with the local version, the development version, which is really not ideal, but it's working fine for now. Great. So to review all those steps we went through, everything was exactly the same as far as git init, Heroku create, add commit, git push Heroku master, but the problem was that our Mongo database was running locally and that wouldn't work on Heroku. So then we went to MongoLab, created a hosted MongoLab database that we can connect to from our local version and from the Heroku version. In the next video, we're going to see how we can change databases depending on if we're using Heroku or if we're writing code locally in development. All right,